You're just sitting here taking up space again, Franklin. My daughter-in-law said those words while my 7-year-old granddaughter was blowing out birthday candles barely 3 feet away from me. The entire dining room went silent. I remember the sound of the air conditioner humming above the kitchen louder than anybody breathing. My coffee cup froze halfway to my mouth. My son Mark stared down at his plate, like suddenly the mashed potatoes had become the most important thing in Texas. Olivia crossed her arms and laughed under her breath. Seriously, she said, looking around the table. All he does is sit in that recliner and watch TV while the rest of us work ourselves to death. My granddaughter Lily whispered, "Mommy," but Olivia kept going. I mean, let's be honest. He's basically another Bill at this point. I looked at my son, waiting for him to say something. Anything. "Mark?" I asked quietly. He rubbed the back of his neck and sighed. "Dad, she's just stressed." That hurt worse than the insult itself. Because in that moment, my own son chose comfort over loyalty. Before I tell you what happened after that night, I want to ask you something. If this story speaks to your heart, or if you've ever felt invisible inside your own family, take a second to like this video and subscribe to the channel only if this story truly resonates with you. And I'd really like to know where you're watching from tonight. Leave your city, your country, and your local time down in the comments. Sometimes it helps to remember we're not as alone as we think we are. My name is Franklin Hayes. I'm 74 years old, and the night my daughter-in-law called me a burden in front of my family was the night everything inside me finally broke. But to understand why that dinner destroyed something in me forever, you need to understand what happened months before anyone sat around that table pretending I was worthless. The birthday party was supposed to be simple. Balloons tied to the staircase. Chocolate cake from a bakery 15 miles outside Dallas, because Lily loved the pink frosting roses they made there. Country music playing softly through the kitchen speaker. I had spent almost $200 on gifts for my granddaughter that week alone. A telescope because she loved stars. New cowgirl boots. A little silver bracelet with her initials engraved on the inside. I wrapped every present myself at the dining room table after everyone went to sleep. My hands shook from arthritis the whole time. Nobody noticed. Nobody ever noticed things like that anymore. Grandpa got me the telescope. Lily shouted earlier that evening, hugging my neck so tight I nearly cried right there in front of everybody. Olivia smiled for exactly 2 seconds before saying, "Well, maybe now she'll stop begging us for expensive junk." Expensive junk. Funny thing is, I paid the property taxes on that house 3 months earlier when Mark fell behind on his construction business payments. $23,000. Quietly. No arguments. No conditions. I transferred the money from one of my investment accounts before breakfast and never mentioned it again. My son had looked me dead in the eye afterward and said, "I'll pay you back soon, Dad." I told him not to worry about it. That's what fathers do. But sitting there at that dinner table listening to his wife call me useless while he stayed silent, I realized something ugly. They had mistaken my kindness for weakness. Olivia leaned against the kitchen counter, swirling wine in her glass. "You know what the problem is with this generation?" she said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Nobody tells old people when it's time to stop depending on their kids." My daughter Sarah nearly choked on her drink. "Olivia," she warned softly. But Olivia shrugged. "What?" "I'm saying what everybody's thinking." I looked over at Mark again. "Do you agree with her?" He didn't answer right away. That pause lasted maybe 3 seconds. But sometimes 3 seconds is long enough to destroy 40 years between a father and a son. "Dad," he finally muttered, "things have just been hard around here lately." I nodded slowly like I understood. But inside, something cold settled into my chest. Not anger. Not yet. Something worse. Clarity. Because at that exact moment, I realized none of them actually knew who I was anymore. Not really. They saw an old man with gray hair and shaky hands sleeping in the guest bedroom upstairs. They saw somebody slowing down. Somebody easy to dismiss. They didn't see the man who still owned almost everything around them. And they definitely didn't know about the phone call I had received 2 weeks earlier from a lawyer in Denver. The one thing I had kept secret from my entire family. The truth is, my family did not start falling apart at that birthday dinner. It started years earlier in tiny little moments nobody thought mattered at the time. Looking back now, I can see them clearly, like cracks spreading across a windshield before it finally shatters. After my wife Evelyn died from breast cancer 8 years ago, I sold our old family home outside Plano because every room in that place hurt too much to walk through alone. Mark came to me 2 weeks later wearing work boots covered in drywall dust, and that worried look fathers recognize immediately in their sons. "Dad," he said quietly over coffee at a diner off Interstate 35, "things are getting tight. The business is slow. We might lose the house." I still remember the smell of bacon grease and burnt toast in that booth. I asked him how much he needed. He looked embarrassed. "I do not know. Maybe 80 grand to stay afloat for a while." $80,000. I did not even hesitate. "Family takes care of family," I told him. His eyes watered up right there in the restaurant. "I swear I will pay you back." I patted his shoulder and smiled. "Your mother would haunt me if I charged my own son interest." 3 months later, I moved into their guest room temporarily while my condo in Denver was being renovated. At least that was the original plan. But temporary slowly became permanent. At first, Olivia acted welcoming enough. She bought extra pillows for the room upstairs and called me Mr. Hayes, in that sweet, polite voice people use when they are trying hard to make a good impression. Then little things started changing. One Saturday morning, I walked into the kitchen and heard Olivia whispering to her friend, Karen, near the refrigerator. "I feel like I have another child in the house," she muttered. Karen laughed. "At least children grow up eventually." They both went silent when they noticed me standing there holding my coffee mug. Olivia forced a smile. "Good morning, Franklin." That was the first time she stopped calling me Mr. Hayes. I pretended not to notice. A few weeks later, I offered to help pay utility bills because Texas summers are brutal and the air conditioning ran almost nonstop. Olivia took the envelope without even looking at me. "That would help," she said flatly. "Electricity is not free." But later that same night, I overheard her talking to Mark in their bedroom downstairs. "Your father acts like paying one bill makes him some kind of hero." Mark answered quietly. "Olivia, come on." "No, seriously," she snapped. "He leaves lights on everywhere. He watches television half the day. Do you know how much groceries cost now?" I stood outside their bedroom door holding a glass of water, feeling smaller than I had felt in decades. The strange thing was, I actually tried harder after that. I cleaned the kitchen every morning before anyone woke up. I folded towels. I fixed the broken fence gate in the backyard during a 100-degree heat wave. I picked Lily up from elementary school twice a week so Olivia would not have to leave work early. One afternoon, Lily hugged my arm while we walked through the parking lot and said, "Grandpa, why does Mommy get mad when you help?" I smiled at her and lied. "Adults just get tired sometimes, sweetheart." But children notice more than adults think. During Thanksgiving dinner that year, Olivia's brother Jason came over wearing a Cowboys jersey and drinking beer straight from the bottle. He looked at me carving turkey and joked, "Franklin's got it figured out. Free rent, free food, no responsibilities." Everybody chuckled except Sarah. My daughter immediately frowned and said, "Dad has done more for this family than anybody at this table." Olivia rolled her eyes. Nobody is attacking him. But Mark stayed quiet again. Always quiet. That silence kept growing heavier every year until it filled every room in the house. Then came the afternoon that changed the way I saw my own son forever. I was sitting on the back patio, repairing Lily's bicycle chain when I accidentally heard Olivia inside talking on speakerphone with somebody from work. "Honestly," she laughed, "I feel like we are babysitting an old man at this point." The words hit harder than she probably intended. But what broke me was hearing Mark in the background saying absolutely nothing while she laughed about me like I was some unwanted stray they had taken in out of pity. That night, for the first time in years, I opened the locked fireproof box hidden in the back of my closet and stared at the documents inside for nearly an hour. Inside that fireproof box were documents nobody in my family had seen in years. Property deeds, investment statements, partnership agreements, and one sealed envelope with my late wife Evelyn's handwriting across the front that simply read, "For Franklin, when you finally see people clearly." I sat on the edge of my bed upstairs while the house stayed quiet around me. Downstairs I could hear the dishwasher running and Olivia laughing at some television show like nothing had happened. I opened one investment statement and stared at the number at the bottom again. Even after all these years, seeing it still felt strange. Evelyn and I had built more than anybody realized. Long before Mark was born, I spent 32 years running commercial roofing projects across Texas, Oklahoma, and Colorado. I worked through heat waves, hailstorms, and nights sleeping inside motel rooms that smelled like cigarette smoke and old carpet cleaner. While other men spent money trying to look rich, Evelyn and I quietly bought land. Small apartment buildings, storage facilities, rental homes in growing neighborhoods before anyone else paid attention to them. We lived modestly on purpose. Evelyn used to say, "Real wealth whispers, Franklin." Somewhere over the years, my own children forgot that. Or maybe I taught them too well never to ask questions about money. 2 days after the birthday dinner, I received another call from Denver. "Mr. Hayes," the woman said warmly through the speakerphone, "the buyer accepted your counteroffer." I looked out the guest room window toward the backyard where Lily's bicycle still leaned against the fence. "So it is done?" I asked quietly. "Yes, sir. Closing is scheduled for next Friday." I thanked her and hung up slowly. That property in Denver had tripled in value over the last decade. The sale alone would bring in more money than Mark had probably made in his entire life. And suddenly I realized something uncomfortable. I was sitting upstairs feeling unwanted inside a house where every adult downstairs depended on me more than they understood. That evening at dinner, Olivia complained about rising mortgage rates while scrolling through her phone. "I swear, if one more expense hits us this year, we are screwed." Normally I would have stepped in immediately. That was my habit. Solve the problem. Calm the panic. Protect everybody. But this time I stayed quiet and kept eating. Mark glanced at me for half a second, almost expecting me to rescue them again. I did not. That was the first moment something changed inside me. Sarah noticed it too. Later that night, she knocked softly on my bedroom door, holding 2 cups of tea. "You okay, Dad?" she asked. I shrugged. "Just tired." She sat beside me on the bed. "No, something is different." I smiled faintly because Sarah had always been the observant one. Even as a little girl, she noticed things nobody else did. "Do you remember when your mother got sick?" I asked her. Sarah nodded immediately. "Of course." "Do you remember what she used to tell me after chemo treatments?" Sarah looked down into her tea. "She said people show you who they are when life becomes inconvenient." I stared at the old fireproof box sitting open in the closet. "Your mother was smarter than me." Sarah followed my eyes toward the documents. "Dad, what is all that?" For a second, I almost told her everything. The properties, the accounts, the trusts, the truth about who actually owned the house downstairs. But instead I closed the lid gently. Just old paperwork. She did not believe me. I could tell. The next morning, I came downstairs wearing a pressed blue button-up shirt instead of my usual flannel. Olivia looked surprised. "Where are you going?" she asked while packing Lily's lunch. "Meeting someone downtown. Business." She laughed lightly like the idea sounded ridiculous. Usually I would have smiled politely and ignored it. But not that morning. I looked directly at her and answered calmly. "Yes. Business." The room went quiet for a second. Even Mark looked confused. I grabbed my car keys from the counter and headed toward the front door. Behind me, Olivia muttered softly, "Since when does he have business meetings?" I stopped with my hand on the doorknob, but did not turn around. "Since before you ever met my son," I said. Then I walked out of the house while upstairs in my closet, hidden beneath old tax records and Evelyn's handwritten letters, sat one document that was about to change every relationship in my family forever. The meeting downtown was not with an old friend or some retirement club like Olivia probably imagined. I drove straight into Dallas traffic and parked outside the office building of Coleman and Price Financial Law on McKinney Avenue. The receptionist smiled politely when I walked in. "Mr. Hayes, Miss Price is waiting for you." Eleanor Price had been handling my legal affairs for nearly 15 years. Sharp woman, early 60s, never wasted words. She stood when I entered her office and shook my hand firmly. "You look tired, Franklin." I gave a dry laugh. Family has a way of doing that. She motioned for me to sit. Through the glass wall behind her, I could see downtown Dallas glowing in the afternoon sun. Expensive suits walking past. Luxury cars below. A completely different world from the one waiting for me back at the house. Eleanor opened a folder slowly. "I reviewed the trust structure again this morning. Nothing has been transferred. Legally speaking, every major asset is still entirely under your control." I nodded quietly. "Good." She studied my face for a moment. "You finally ready to talk about why you suddenly want everything reviewed?" I leaned back in the leather chair and stared at the ceiling for a second before answering. "They think I need them." Eleanor folded her hands carefully. "And do you?" That question stayed hanging in the room longer than I expected. Because the honest answer scared me a little. For years I had convinced myself I stayed in that house because family mattered more than pride. But sitting there in that office, I realized something painful. Somewhere along the way, I had allowed guilt to replace respect. Eleanor slid another document across the desk. There is something else you should know. I looked down at the paperwork. It was a refinancing inquiry tied to Mark's construction company. Several pages deep, I saw my own name listed beside collateral references connected to the house. My stomach tightened immediately. What is this? Eleanor's voice became careful. Your son attempted to leverage the property for additional business debt 6 months ago. I stared at her in disbelief. That house is not even in his name. Exactly. My chest suddenly felt heavy. Did he forge anything? No. The bank blocked the application before it went further because ownership records did not match his claims. I sat frozen in silence. Mark had never mentioned any of this to me. Not one word. Then Eleanor reached for another file. Franklin, there is more. She turned the document toward me. Printed across the top was a draft proposal from a senior assisted living facility outside Fort Worth. Estimated monthly costs. Medical options. Long-term placement packages. My name typed clearly across the first page. I actually laughed for a second because my brain could not process what I was looking at. What the hell is this? Eleanor looked uncomfortable for the first time since I had known her. The facility contacted our office 2 weeks ago requesting confirmation of your financial standing. I could hear blood rushing in my ears. Who contacted them? She hesitated. Your daughter-in-law. I felt something inside me collapse right there in that chair. Not anger. Not even heartbreak anymore. Something colder. Something final. Olivia had been researching places to move me into without ever speaking to me first. Like I was already becoming an inconvenience they needed professionally handled. And the worst part was realizing Mark probably knew. Suddenly dozens of little moments started connecting in my head. The whispered conversations stopping when I entered rooms. The way Olivia kept mentioning retirement communities during dinner. The brochures I once found on the kitchen counter before they mysteriously disappeared. Dear God, they had already been planning my exit while smiling at me across the breakfast table every morning. Franklin, Eleanor said softly, you need to prepare yourself carefully before confronting this. But I was barely listening anymore, because at that exact moment my phone buzzed across the desk. It was Sarah. I answered immediately. Dad. Her voice sounded panicked. You need to come home right now. My stomach dropped. What happened? There was a long silence before she answered. Mark and Olivia found the lockbox in your closet. The drive back to the house felt longer than any trip I had taken in years. Dallas traffic crawled under the late afternoon heat while my hands tightened around the steering wheel hard enough to make my knuckles ache. I kept hearing Sarah's voice repeating in my head. They found the lockbox. They found the lockbox. By the time I pulled into the driveway, 3 cars were already parked outside. Mark's truck, Sarah's sedan, and Olivia's white SUV sitting crooked near the curb like somebody had parked in a hurry. I walked through the front door and immediately felt the tension in the air. Nobody said hello. Nobody asked if I was okay. The fireproof box sat open on the dining room table, surrounded by papers spread everywhere like evidence at a trial. Property deeds, bank statements, investment summaries. Olivia stood beside the table pale-faced with crossed arms while Mark stared down at the floor. Sarah looked furious. Dad, she said softly, I told them to stop going through your things. Olivia snapped immediately. We were not snooping. I looked directly at her. Then why was my locked box open? She hesitated for half a second before answering. The key was in your dresser. Inside my private bedroom. Mark finally stepped forward. Dad, please calm down. I almost laughed hearing those words. Calm down. As if I was the one violating boundaries. Olivia picked up one of the property documents with shaking hands. You own all of this? She asked quietly. Not with admiration. With calculation. That was the moment I truly saw her. Not a stressed mother. Not an overwhelmed wife. A person suddenly terrified she had misjudged the value of the man she had spent years diminishing. Sarah folded her arms. You had no right to touch any of this. Olivia ignored her completely. Mark told me your retirement savings were modest. I turned slowly toward my son. Is that what you believed? Mark rubbed his face nervously. Dad, you never talked about money. Because I did not raise my children to measure people by it. The room fell silent again. Then Olivia made the mistake that changed everything permanently. She looked directly at me and said, well, maybe if we knew the truth earlier, things would have been different around here. There it was. Not regret for how they treated me. Regret for not knowing sooner what I was worth financially. I felt something inside me finally go numb. Completely numb. That night, I locked myself upstairs while downstairs I could hear whispered arguing through the floorboards. At around 11:30, my phone buzzed. A text from Mark. Dad, can we talk tomorrow? Another message came 3 minutes later. Olivia did not mean any harm. Then another. We appreciate everything you have done. I stared at the screen for a long time without responding. The next morning, there was a handwritten note left outside my bedroom door in Olivia's handwriting. Franklin, I think we have all misunderstood each other lately. Maybe we can start fresh. I almost admired how quickly her tone changed once money entered the conversation. Almost. Later that afternoon, Mark knocked softly on my door, carrying coffee from my favorite diner. Dad, he said carefully, can I come in? I opened the door halfway, but did not invite him inside. He handed me the cup awkwardly. I know things got out of control. Did they? I asked quietly. He swallowed hard. Olivia feels terrible. About what exactly? He looked confused. What do you mean? Does she feel terrible because of how she treated me? Or because she discovered what I own? He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. That silence answered everything. Over the next few days, the entire atmosphere inside the house changed in ways that made my skin crawl. Olivia suddenly started asking if I needed anything from the grocery store. Mark offered to take me golfing. Even Jason, the brother-in-law who joked about me freeloading during Thanksgiving, sent me a text message saying, we should grab dinner sometime, Franklin. Family matters. Every word felt fake. Every smile felt rehearsed. One evening, I walked downstairs and heard Olivia on the phone in the kitchen whispering urgently to somebody. No, you do not understand, she said. The house is still in his name. Everything is. She froze when she noticed me standing there. Franklin, I was just talking to my sister. I nodded once and walked away without answering. Because by then I understood the truth completely. I was no longer a person inside that house. I had become an asset everybody was suddenly afraid of losing. And somehow that realization felt lonelier than every insult that came before it. For the next 2 weeks, I barely recognized my own life. The house became painfully polite. Every conversation sounded rehearsed. Every kindness carried tension underneath it. Olivia started making my favorite breakfasts on Sundays. Mark suddenly asked about my health every evening after work. Even little things changed. My laundry was folded neatly outside my bedroom door. The television remote stopped mysteriously disappearing from the living room. But none of it felt real anymore. Once you realize people are adjusting their behavior because of what you own instead of who you are, something inside you shuts down permanently. One rainy Tuesday night, I sat alone in my room holding an old framed photograph of Evelyn taken at Galveston Beach back in 1989. Wind blowing through her hair, bare feet in the sand. That smile she always gave me right before laughing. I remember whispering out loud, "You warned me." The room stayed quiet except for the sound of rain tapping the windows. Evelyn used to tell me that loneliness inside a crowded house was the worst kind there was. Back then, I never understood what she meant. I understood now. A few days later, I visited her grave alone for the first time in nearly 6 months. The cemetery sat outside Plano under rows of old oak trees bending in the wind. I brought fresh white roses because those were always her favorite. As I stood there staring at her name carved into stone, I realized how long it had been since somebody truly looked at me with love instead of expectation. I failed somewhere, I said quietly. I raised good kids, did I not? Of course there was no answer. Just wind moving through dead leaves across the grass. When I got back home that afternoon, I walked inside and heard Olivia laughing in the kitchen with her friend Karen again. I am telling you, Karen whispered loudly. Old people get emotional when they feel insecure. Olivia sighed dramatically. Things have just been awkward lately. I stood frozen near the hallway listening. Well, Karen replied, at least now you know to stay close to him. Men with money at that age get manipulated easily. Then Olivia laughed softly and answered, trust me, I know exactly what I am doing. Something strange happened inside me then. Not heartbreak, not rage, recognition, clear and sharp. For years I kept trying to earn comfort in a house I was already financing. I kept shrinking myself to avoid becoming inconvenient. I kept accepting disrespect because I was terrified of losing family after losing Evelyn. But standing there hearing my life discussed like a financial strategy finally woke something up in me. That night at dinner, Mark noticed I barely touched my food. "Dad, you okay?" he asked. I looked at him for a long moment before answering. "Can I ask you something honestly?" He nodded carefully. "Do you remember the last real conversation we had that was not about money, stress, or obligations?" He blinked like the question caught him off guard. "What do you mean?" "I mean, when was the last time you wanted to spend time with me because I was your father and not because you needed something?" Mark stared down at his plate immediately. Olivia jumped in quickly. "Franklin, that is not fair." I looked directly at her. "No. Fair would have been honesty from the beginning." The room went completely silent. Even Lily stopped eating. A few seconds later, I pushed my chair back calmly and walked upstairs. Nobody followed me. That hurt more than if they had argued. The next morning, I woke up before sunrise and sat by the bedroom window with coffee, watching the neighborhood slowly come alive. Sprinklers clicking across green lawns. Newspaper trucks rolling down the street. Kids waiting for school buses. Ordinary life continuing like always. And for the first time in years, I admitted something to myself I had been avoiding. I was not staying in that house out of love anymore. I was staying because I did not know who I was without being needed. Around 8:30, my phone buzzed with a message from Eleanor Price. "The closing documents are finalized. Whenever you are ready, everything can move forward immediately." I stared at the screen for a very long time before finally typing back 4 words that quietly changed the direction of my entire life. "Let us begin the transfer." 3 weeks later, I quietly left the house before sunrise with 2 suitcases, a leather briefcase, and Evelyn's photograph wrapped carefully inside a winter sweater. Nobody heard me leave except Lily. She stood halfway down the staircase in pink pajamas, rubbing sleep from her eyes. "Grandpa," she whispered. I smiled gently. "Go back to bed, sweetheart. Are you coming home later?" That question nearly stopped me from walking out the front door. I knelt slowly so my knees would not crack too loudly on the hardwood floor and kissed her forehead. "I think Grandpa needs to build a new home for a while." Her small face looked confused. "Did I do something wrong?" "No," I said immediately. "Never you." Then I stood up, grabbed my suitcase, and stepped into the cold morning air without looking back again. By noon, I was on a flight to Colorado. The cabin I bought sat outside a small town near Grand Lake, tucked beside pine trees with mountains rising behind them like something from an old postcard. The air smelled different there. Cleaner, colder, honest somehow. The first few days felt strange. Too quiet. I kept expecting somebody to knock on my bedroom door asking for money, favors, or solutions. But nobody did. For the first time in years, my schedule belonged entirely to me. I woke before sunrise and made coffee slowly. I walked 2 miles around the lake every morning wearing Evelyn's old denim jacket. I cooked my own meals, read books, fixed the porch railing myself one afternoon while snow drifted softly through the trees. Small things, ordinary things, but they started stitching something back together inside me. One morning at the local diner, a waitress named Claire poured my coffee and smiled. "You were the new guy in cabin 12, right?" I nodded. "That obvious?" She laughed softly. "Small town. Everybody notices." Over the next few weeks, I started becoming part of the rhythm there. The hardware store owner, Pete, asked if I could help review renovation estimates on an old commercial building he wanted to buy. "You worked construction your whole life?" he asked while we stood outside the property in 30-degree weather. "Something like that." I spent 2 hours walking the building with him, pointing out structural problems and roofing issues. At the end, he stared at me like I had just saved him $50,000. "Franklin, you seriously know your stuff." I had forgotten what it felt like to be respected for experience instead of tolerated because of age. Word spread quickly after that. Then another local business owner called asking for advice on a warehouse investment. Then another. Suddenly, I found myself reviewing contracts over black coffee at diners again like I had 20 years earlier. Except this time nobody was using me. They were listening to me. One evening, Sarah called while I was sitting beside the fireplace, watching snow fall outside the cabin windows. "Dad?" she asked carefully. "You sound different." I smiled without realizing it. Maybe I finally sound like myself again. She stayed quiet for a second before speaking softly. "Mark is struggling." I stared into the fire. "Financially, emotionally too." I nodded slowly but did not answer. Sarah sighed. "He misses you." "No," I said calmly. "He misses certainty." Another long silence followed. "Dad, are you coming back?" I looked around the cabin. The warm light. The pine walls. Evelyn's photograph sitting peacefully. beside the fireplace mantel. I do not think so. The truth was, I had stopped feeling old after leaving Texas. Exhausted, yes. Hurt, absolutely. But not old. Back there, every day revolved around becoming smaller to fit inside somebody else's comfort. Out here, I started remembering who I had been before grief and guilt turned me invisible. About 2 months after arriving in Colorado, I received a call from Eleanor Price. "Franklin," she said, sounding unusually impressed, "you may want to sit down for this." I stepped outside onto the porch while cold mountain wind moved through the trees. "What happened?" "The commercial property you sold in Denver," she said. "A developer just made an offer on the adjoining land you still own." I frowned slightly. "I forgot I even kept that parcel." Eleanor laughed softly. "Well, do not forget it now. Because if this deal closes, your net worth is about to change dramatically." The land deal closed 6 weeks later for an amount that honestly shocked even me. After taxes and restructuring, Eleanor estimated the transaction added several $1,000,000 to my portfolio almost overnight. I remember standing outside the bank in downtown Denver wearing a charcoal wool coat while snow drifted across the sidewalks, staring at the final paperwork in my hands. For years I had lived like a man shrinking from the world. Suddenly life felt wide open again. But the biggest change was not financial. It was internal. I stopped apologizing for existing. I stopped lowering my voice. I stopped entering rooms already prepared to make myself smaller for other people's comfort. Eleanor noticed it first. During lunch one afternoon, she leaned back in her chair and smiled at me over a glass of iced tea. "You walk differently now." I laughed softly. "What does that even mean?" "It means you finally stopped carrying guilt that never belonged to you." A month later, Pete introduced me to a local commercial development group restoring old properties around Grand County. They wanted experienced oversight on structural acquisitions and renovation planning. Younger investors with money, but very little practical knowledge. I attended one meeting mostly out of curiosity. The conference room overlooked frozen mountains and smelled like fresh coffee and cedarwood. Men in expensive jackets sat around polished oak tables throwing around numbers like poker chips. One of them, a 30-something developer named Ryan Mercer, pointed toward a set of blueprints and said, "The roof replacement estimate seems high." I studied the plans quietly for less than 30 seconds before answering. "Because your contractor missed the snow load calculations." The room went silent. Ryan frowned. "What?" I walked to the table and tapped 2 sections of the structural report. "Those beams will fail under winter accumulation within 5 years unless reinforced properly." An older engineer sitting near the window suddenly looked at me carefully. "Who are you?" Before I could answer, Pete grinned proudly and said, "That is Franklin Hayes. And if Franklin tells you something about a building, you listen." I had not felt respected like that in years. 3 weeks later, they offered me a consulting position. Nothing flashy. But when I walked into the office for the first time and saw my name printed neatly on the glass door beside the title Senior Structural Advisor, something inside me became emotional in a way I did not expect. Not because of status, because somebody still saw value in me beyond age. Claire teased me about it one morning at the diner. "Look at you," she laughed while pouring coffee. "Big-time mountain businessman now." I smiled and adjusted the small silver name badge clipped to my winter jacket. "Careful. I might start charging celebrity prices for advice." "Too late." Pete interrupted from the next booth. "You already saved me $100,000 this year." The strange thing was, the more confident I became, the less angry I felt toward my family. Distance changed things. Pain that once felt sharp slowly turned into understanding. Not forgiveness exactly, just clarity. Mark had spent so many years feeling inadequate financially that he confused dependence with security. Olivia chased stability so desperately that she stopped recognizing human dignity along the way. None of it excused what happened, but bitterness stopped owning me. One evening, Sarah visited Colorado for the weekend. We sat outside the cabin wrapped in blankets while snow fell softly around the porch lights. "Dad," she said quietly, "you seem happy." I stared toward the mountains for a long moment before answering. "I think I finally remembered that my life did not end when your mother died." Sarah smiled sadly. "She would love this version of you." That sentence stayed with me long after she went inside to sleep. Because for years after Evelyn passed away, I had slowly turned myself into a man surviving instead of living. And somewhere in that survival, I handed away pieces of myself little by little until there was almost nothing left. But now things were changing. Not loudly, quietly, steadily, like sunrise creeping over snow-covered mountains. Then one cold Thursday afternoon, nearly 8 months after I left Texas, my phone rang while I was reviewing renovation contracts inside my office. I looked down at the screen and saw Mark's name for the first time in almost 3 months. I let it ring twice before answering. Hello. On the other end, my son sounded exhausted. Dad, we need to talk. Something happened. Mark sounded older on the phone that afternoon. Not physically older. Worn down. Like life had finally stopped cushioning him from consequences. I leaned back slowly in my office chair while snow pressed softly against the windows outside. What happened? I asked calmly. There was a long pause before he answered. It is Lily. Every muscle in my body tightened immediately. What about her? She collapsed at school yesterday. My heart dropped straight into my stomach. Is she okay? The doctors think she will be fine, he said quickly, almost panicked. But they found something during testing. They want to run more scans. I stood up immediately and grabbed my coat without even realizing it. Which hospital? Children's Medical Center in Dallas. The flight from Denver felt endless. I barely slept the entire trip. Every terrible possibility ran through my mind while the plane cut through black clouds over Texas. By the time I reached the hospital the next morning, exhaustion sat heavy behind my eyes. The pediatric wing smelled like antiseptic and stale coffee. Parents walked hallways carrying fear on their faces like invisible luggage. I found Mark sitting alone near the waiting area outside Lily's room, staring down at a paper cup gone cold in his hands. When he looked up and saw me standing there, his face cracked emotionally for the first time in years. Dad, he whispered. He stood awkwardly like he wanted to hug me, but did not know if he had earned the right anymore. I placed a hand on his shoulder instead. How is she? Sleeping? His voice shook slightly. They think it may be neurological. They are not sure yet. I nodded slowly and looked through the glass window into the room. Lily lay curled beneath pale blue blankets with stuffed animals beside her. Tubes. Monitors. Tiny hospital socks. Seeing her there physically hurt. Can I go in? I asked quietly. Mark nodded immediately. She asked for you when she woke up earlier. That sentence nearly broke me. Inside the room, machines beeped softly in the background while morning sunlight filtered through the blinds. Lily opened her eyes slowly when she heard my footsteps. Grandpa, she whispered weakly. I forced a smile and sat carefully beside the bed. Hey there, cowgirl. She reached for my hand immediately. Her fingers felt so small wrapped around mine. Mommy said you moved to the mountains. I did. Do they have horses there? I laughed softly despite everything. More horses than people. She smiled faintly. Then her expression changed. Are you still mad at Daddy? The question caught me completely off guard. I looked down at her for a long moment before answering honestly. I was hurt for a while. Mommy cries at night sometimes, she whispered. I hear her. I felt my chest tighten again. Children always hear more than adults realize. Before I could answer, the door opened behind me. Olivia stepped inside, carrying paperwork from the front desk. The second she saw me sitting beside Lily's bed, she froze. For a moment, neither of us spoke. She looked exhausted. No makeup. Eyes swollen from lack of sleep. Smaller somehow than I remembered. Franklin, she said quietly. I nodded once. Olivia. The tension inside that room felt heavy enough to touch. But this time things were different. Months earlier, I would have entered that space already emotionally defensive, already preparing myself to absorb discomfort quietly just to keep peace. Not anymore. Now I sat there steady while she stood uncertain near the doorway. The balance had shifted completely. A doctor entered moments later carrying a tablet and several folders tucked beneath his arm. Mr. and Mrs. Hayes? He asked carefully. Mark immediately stood from the hallway and walked inside. The doctor glanced toward me politely. And you must be Lily's grandfather. I nodded. He looked around the room slowly before speaking again. We received the latest scan results this morning. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The doctor lowered the folder onto the counter beside Lily's bed and said quietly, there is something important your family needs to understand before we move forward. The doctor closed the door gently behind him before speaking again. The scans revealed a congenital vascular condition. He explained carefully while pulling images onto the tablet screen. We believe Lily inherited it genetically. Olivia immediately grabbed Mark's hand. Inherited? She asked nervously. The doctor nodded. These conditions often run through family bloodlines, even when symptoms do not appear until later in childhood. My stomach tightened slightly, because suddenly I remembered something Evelyn once mentioned years ago about distant relatives on her side dealing with circulation disorders. The doctor continued calmly. The good news is we caught this early. With proper treatment and monitoring, Lily has an excellent chance of living a completely normal life. Mark exhaled hard and rubbed both hands over his face. Olivia sat down slowly beside the hospital bed, looking like all the strength had drained out of her body. Then the doctor added something unexpected. There is one complication, however. The room became still again. The treatment options available through the specialist program we recommend are extremely expensive. Most insurance providers only cover part of it. Mark swallowed visibly. How expensive? The doctor hesitated politely. Over the next several years, potentially several $100,000, depending on surgical intervention. Silence spread through the room like fog. I watched my son's face carefully. Fear. Real fear this time. Not pride. Not ego. Just a father terrified for his little girl. Olivia looked down at the floor, whispering softly, "Oh my God." The doctor handed over several folders before leaving quietly to give us privacy. Nobody spoke for almost a full minute after the door closed. Machines beeped softly near Lily's bed while she slept again under warm blankets, completely unaware of the storm surrounding her. Finally, Mark looked at me. "Dad," his voice cracked slightly. I held up my hand gently. "Do not." He stared at me confused. "What?" "Do not ask me for help because you are desperate. Ask me because I am your father." The words landed hard in the room. Olivia looked down immediately. Mark blinked several times like he was trying not to break apart emotionally. Then quietly, honestly, he said something I never expected to hear from him. "I do not know how to be your son anymore." That sentence hurt more than any argument ever could. Because underneath all the mistakes and pride and silence, I suddenly realized how lost he actually was. Olivia stood slowly and walked toward the window with tears building in her eyes. "Franklin," she whispered without turning around, "I know I cannot undo things." I stayed quiet. "But I need you to understand something," she continued softly. "I grew up terrified of instability. My father lost everything when I was 13. Our house, our savings, everything. My mother worked double shifts just to keep food on the table." Her voice shook slightly now. "I spent my whole adult life trying to protect my family from ever feeling that kind of fear again." I listened without interrupting. "That does not excuse how I treated you," she said quietly. "But fear changes people in ugly ways." For the first time since all of this began, I heard honesty instead of performance in her voice. Not manipulation, not strategy, just exhaustion. I looked over at Lily sleeping peacefully beneath hospital lights and finally answered. "Money does not protect families nearly as much as respect does." Olivia closed her eyes after hearing that. Mark sat down heavily in the chair beside the bed and stared at his daughter. "I failed everybody," he muttered quietly. "No," I said calmly. "You forgot who you were trying to become." He looked up slowly. I reached into my coat pocket and removed a folded envelope Eleanor had prepared before I flew to Texas. I placed it carefully on the small hospital table between us. Mark frowned slightly. "What is that?" "Updated trust documents." Olivia turned around immediately. The room felt suddenly smaller somehow. "I spent the last year rebuilding my life," I said evenly. "And during that time I made some decisions about the future." Mark stared at the envelope but did not touch it. "Dad, open it." His hands shook slightly as he unfolded the papers. I watched his eyes move across the first page, then the second. Then suddenly he stopped breathing for a second entirely. Olivia stepped closer. "What is it?" Mark looked up at me with tears forming in his eyes. He transferred everything. His voice broke completely. "The trusts, the properties, all of it is in Lily's name." The room stayed completely silent after Mark read the documents. Even the hospital monitors seemed louder somehow. Olivia slowly covered her mouth with one hand while staring at the trust papers spread across the table. "Franklin," she whispered, almost unable to process what she was seeing. Mark looked back down at the documents again like maybe he misunderstood them the first time. But he had not. Months earlier, after leaving Texas, I had worked with Eleanor to restructure nearly everything I owned. The commercial properties in Denver, the investment accounts, the land partnerships, the trusts Evelyn and I built over decades. All of it now flowed into one protected estate structure under Lily's name with strict legal conditions attached. Nobody could touch the principal balance. Nobody could leverage the assets. Nobody could manipulate distributions. Educational expenses, medical care, housing security, and future protection for Lily were guaranteed, no matter what happened to the adults around her. Eleanor spent nearly 4 months building it carefully. I remembered one conversation with her inside her Denver office during the final drafting process. "Are you certain about this?" she asked me while reviewing the paperwork. I nodded slowly. I spent too much of my life trying to hold adults together. I would rather protect the child. Back in the hospital room, Mark finally looked up at me again with tears sliding openly down his face now. "Dad, this is everything." "No," I answered quietly. "It is not everything. It is responsibility." Olivia pulled out the nearest chair and sat down heavily like her legs could no longer hold her. "Why would you still do this for us after everything?" I looked toward Lily sleeping peacefully under the blankets. "I did not do it for you." Another silence settled across the room, but this one felt different. Not hostile, honest. Mark wiped his face roughly with both hands. "I do not even know how to thank you." "Then do not," I replied calmly. "Just become better parents than you have been people lately." The words landed softly but sharply enough that neither of them looked away from them. Olivia stared at the floor for several seconds before finally speaking again. "I used to think security came from controlling everything," she admitted quietly. "Money, stability, appearances." She looked over at Lily's hospital bed. "But sitting in this room the last 2 days, none of that mattered." I nodded once. "Fear changes priorities." She swallowed hard before meeting my eyes directly for the first time in months. "I know I hurt you." I held her gaze steadily. "Yes, you did." No anger in my voice. No bitterness. Just truth. Somehow that seemed harder for her to hear than shouting ever would have been. Mark leaned forward in his chair. "Dad, come back home with us." The request hung in the air quietly. I could tell he already knew the answer before I spoke. "No," his shoulders dropped slightly. "I figured. I love you," I said carefully. "Both of you. But love without boundaries destroys people." I learned that too late. Nobody argued with me. Nobody tried to persuade me otherwise. Because deep down they understood. I had spent years sacrificing dignity for proximity. Years confusing endurance with family loyalty. That part of my life was over now. A nurse entered briefly to check Lily's medication before leaving again. As soon as the door closed, Olivia asked softly, "Will you still be part of her life?" I looked at my granddaughter sleeping peacefully beside the stuffed rabbit tucked beneath her arm. "Always." Olivia broke down crying quietly after hearing that. Not dramatic sobbing. Just exhausted tears from somebody finally confronting themselves honestly. Mark stood up and walked toward the hospital window, staring out over downtown Dallas, glowing in the evening darkness. "I thought success meant protecting my family financially," he said quietly. "I did not realize I was losing my family while chasing it." I watched him standing there and suddenly saw not the grown man who failed me, but the frightened little boy who used to crawl into my lap during thunderstorms asking if everything would be okay. Somewhere along the road between childhood and adulthood, fear hardened him into somebody he never intended to become. And maybe if I was honest with myself, I had helped create some of that fear too. The hospital room grew quieter as night settled in around us. Machines hummed softly. Snowless Texas rain tapped faintly against the windows. Then Lily stirred gently in her sleep and whispered one small sentence that none of us were emotionally prepared to hear. "Grandpa, are we a family again now?" Life did not magically become perfect after that night in the hospital. Real families do not heal in one emotional conversation. Trust does not return all at once just because tears are shed and truths are spoken out loud. But something important changed after that moment. The pretending stopped. And sometimes honesty is the first real step toward peace. Lily's treatment began 2 weeks later with specialists in Dallas and Denver coordinating together through the trust fund Eleanor helped establish. I stayed in Colorado most of the year, but every few weeks Lily would fly out to visit me during school breaks. Those became some of the happiest days of my life. We fished together at the lake behind the cabin. We drank hot chocolate beside the fireplace while snow covered the mountains outside. She learned how to identify constellations through the telescope I bought her years earlier. One evening she looked up at the stars and asked me quietly, "Grandpa, why do people hurt each other when they love each other?" I sat there for a long moment before answering because that question deserved honesty. Sometimes people get so afraid of losing things, I told her softly, that they forget how to love the people standing right in front of them. She nodded slowly like children sometimes do when they understand more than adults expect. Mark changed too, though not quickly. Real growth rarely happens dramatically. It happens in uncomfortable little choices repeated over time. He sold the oversized SUV, downsized the house, started rebuilding his construction business honestly instead of chasing appearances. The first time he visited Colorado alone, we sat quietly on the porch for almost an hour before either of us spoke. Finally, he looked out toward the mountains and said, "I spent years trying to prove I was successful enough to deserve respect." I nodded once, and he gave a tired smile. Turns out respect disappears the second you stop giving it to others. That was probably the most honest thing my son had ever said to me. Olivia surprised me the most. She began volunteering twice a week at a family support center connected to the hospital network, helping parents dealing with medical debt and housing insecurity. One afternoon, while Lily was drawing pictures in the living room, Olivia stood beside the kitchen counter in my cabin and quietly said, "I think fear turned me into somebody I would not have liked growing up." I poured 2 cups of coffee and handed her one gently. "Fear can do that." She looked down into the steam rising from the cup. "Do you think people can really change?" I thought about Evelyn, about grief, about pride, about all the years I spent shrinking myself just to avoid conflict. I think people change when they stop protecting the version of themselves that hurts others. She cried quietly after that, but for once there was no performance in it. Just truth. These days my life is slower, simpler, peaceful in ways I did not understand were possible before. Every morning I wake before sunrise and sit on the porch wrapped in Evelyn's old denim jacket while the mountains turn gold beneath the early light. Sometimes Lily sits beside me reading books under a blanket. Sometimes Mark calls just to ask how my morning is going. Not because he needs money. Not because there is a problem to solve. Just because I am his father. And maybe that matters again now. If there is one thing this story taught me, it is this. Love without boundaries eventually becomes self-abandonment. You can help people without disappearing inside their needs. You can forgive people without reopening every door they once damaged. And you can walk away from places that make you feel invisible without becoming bitter. That took me 74 years to learn. So if somebody listening to my voice tonight feels trapped inside relationships where your value only seems recognized when you are useful, please hear me carefully. Your kindness should never require the destruction of your dignity. Protect your peace. Protect your finances. Protect your spirit. Listen when your instincts whisper that something feels wrong long before your heart is ready to admit it. Sometimes God, or the universe if you prefer to call it that, removes your comfort so you can finally see your worth clearly. My name is Franklin Hayes. I am 74 years old. And the core lesson I want to leave with you is this. Never let loneliness convince you to tolerate disrespect disguised as family. Tonight, as I finish telling this story, Lily's silver bracelet catches the firelight beside Evelyn's old photograph on the mantel across the room. One gift from the past. One promise for the future. And somehow those two things finally sit beside each other peacefully now. Thank you for spending this time with me. Truly, if this story stayed with you in some small way, I hope it reminded you that healing does not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it arrives quietly, like snow falling over mountains after a long winter. And if you are still carrying pain from your own family story, I hope you remember this tonight. Being alone for a season is far less dangerous than losing yourself forever just to keep others comfortable. If this story meant something to you, feel free to leave a comment sharing where you are listening from tonight and what lesson stayed in your heart the most. And if you would like to hear more stories about family, healing, betrayal, second chances, and the quiet strength people discover after life breaks them open, there are more journeys waiting for you in the next videos on this channel. Somewhere out there, another story may feel a little too familiar. Another family may remind you of your own. And maybe, just maybe, the next story will help somebody else feel a little less alone too.